Thank you, Steve. Again, my name is Peter DiPippo. I'm the Private Well Program Manager for the state of Rhode Island. Just a show of hands, how many people are here from states that have a private well program? Oh, excellent. Good.
Is that your mic?
Yeah, my mic's a little hot. Oh, actually.
Here. Get rid of that guy.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, great. So what I've done is I've passed around a little bit of feedback here. Is that better? Great. Is I passed around the most recent publication that we have from our department, which is about, it's a 1.5 or 1 page, both sides, that explains to everybody involved in real estate transactions in the state what they need to do to test their well during the course of a transaction, or what they need to do to test their well for a new well on new construction. And you'll see it basically boils down to buyers are obligated to test and sellers are obligated to disclose all prior testing. And on the back, it has an extensive list of what's required to be tested for, which you may be surprised to see includes VOCs and MTBE. What I'd like to talk to you about a little bit today is the state of this and how we came to where we are and some of the recent successes this program has had in identifying areas within the state of unknown and sometimes surprising contamination. So let me begin. So,
This is still here if you need it.
thank you. So just a little bit about the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island is south of Massachusetts, east of Connecticut. There's not really much of the United States out that direction. We are on the land. We're not Long Island. We're not Block Island. We're actually land. We have 2 senators and for the moment 2 representatives. We're about 1,050,000 people and about 61,820 properties are serviced by private wells within that. It's approximately 120,000 people, plus or minus. Back in 1962, the state offered free testing. As far as I've been able to tell, it was mostly at that time for bacteria. In 1973, shortly after the passage of the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Rhode Island Housing Mortgage Finance Company required septic testing and testing in the area of agriculture. And in 1980, there was an executive order by the governor in response to VOC contamination near landfills within the state that ordered private wells in the vicinity of landfills be tested and those records be kept at the state. Okay. In 1984, that was expanded to include pesticides. Aldicarb was the pesticide. The trade name is Temic. It was used extensively to combat the potato beetle. There's a substantial amount of potato agriculture at that point, which has now been in large part replaced by either housing tracts or turf farms. But the testing was expanded at that point in time. And in 1988, the office which I occupy, the Office of Private Well Water Contamination, was established by legislation. And it has a variety of statutory duties. In 1990, we entered into a cooperative program with the University of Rhode Island Extension. And as Steve so kindly mentioned, URI does the outreach and education, and we do the enforcement. So Allison McCann at the university is the velvet glove, and I'm the iron fist. That's the way that works. Okay. In 2001, a single leaking underground storage tank contaminated 130 residents' well water with MTBE. That was a public system in Pasco, Rhode Island. It was an ExxonMobil tank, and just recently settled with the local residents for a significant number of millions of dollars in the contamination. And it took a little while for MTBE to be banned as a fuel additive within Rhode Island. So those laws finally went into place in 2006. MTBE, sort of this is a law of unintended consequences. MTBE is an oxygenate. It was used to replace lead in gasoline, and it's since been replaced by corn ethanol. So it makes for cleaner burning gasoline. As a volatile organic, it was not whether it was known or not at the time, it was not known to me, that it travels pretty readily through freshwater aquifers and had essentially snuck underneath this neighborhood and the public water system. This neighborhood is still reeling from the trauma associated with that. That event was discovered the weekend of September 11th, 2001. And it was after residents had reported to the health department that they had been experiencing this awkward aroma coming through. The transport of MTBE is so quick that they had actually just completed their quarterly VOC sampling and found nothing. And so the health department had every reason at that point in time to say, it must be in your head. But in fact, a private well owner sampled their well, sampled the volatiles, came up with a spike in MTBE, and that was the end of that. To give you an idea of how much trauma was created by that event, recently a natural gas power plant has been proposed to use that abandoned well, the abandoned public well, for its processed water, and they would treat that water, and I can only describe the public response as though they were opening Chernobyl. Chernobyl, did I say that? Okay. So the power plant actually has now had to seek an outside water supply, and they will be trucking water from the Providence public water supply approximately 20 miles, as opposed to just tapping into the abandoned well in nearby. Okay. So as I mentioned, in 1988, the Office which I occupy was created. Their statute outlines the duties. It was amended in 2002 to include real estate transfers. And to give you an idea of how slow the wheels of, as one person described to me, how slow the speed of state is, the regulations were not promulgated until 2008. And when I arrived at the Department of Health in 2013, there were various components of the regulations which still had not been implemented, and we worked quickly to expedite those. So just a quick overview. My job is to coordinate the response of all state agencies to private well water contamination, to inform public officials of private well contamination issues, to advise well owners, public officials, and everybody else of the policies, standards, et cetera, and to develop education materials about the private well issues. Okay. Additionally, we do emergency response, and lately emergency response has been drought, flooding, and hurricane. We develop and promulgate rules and regulations, and we maintain a database of the results. So right now we're in the process of aggregating some of the databases that we have from the old FERDS system and some element systems and some intermediate systems. We do have an online access to about 5,000 results, and then we have the laboratory records available to us. So we use the public drinking water standards for private wells. We require testing for new wells, we require testing at time of transfer, we require sellers to disclose and buyers to test. That's the way our regs work. We license samplers, we license people who interpret the results, and we license the laboratories. So there's a complete licensure chain there. The samplers typically are home inspectors. The interpreters of the results are typically laboratory directors, though we do have a couple of hydrogeologists who are licensed to interpret the results. Laboratories also employ both samplers and interpreters. And because the enforcement is largely in the hands of local building officials when it comes to issuing certificates of occupancy or to condemning properties, we have to establish guidance for municipal building officials as to what constitutes potable for private wells. Okay. So in implementation, we've focused simply on one desired outcome, and that's safe drinking water. When we talk to the stakeholders, we ask very simply, why would you want this water to be tested? And we identify what the driving forces are. So whether that's for the banks, the lenders, anybody who's handling the money, or the homeowner, risk management, or for the people who conduct the tests, the licensed professionals in between, profit, or from people like myself and community officials, the public health. And our goal is to direct the stakeholders towards their self-interest. We believe that people are pretty good at acting in their self-interest, and if we can define what that is and align it with our interests, it moves along pretty well. So this is pretty complicated. I describe this as, these are all the different parties that are involved in a private well in the state of Rhode Island. I've just recently added a couple more. EPA and CDC are in here, as well as the network of hospitals. And I say sometimes being a regulator here is like policing the interstate on a tricycle. In that I'm not going to catch you speeding, but if you get in a wreck, I will get you. So if you could see right here, they're color coded on the slide here. And if I could just work from the center is the laboratory. To the left is the home inspector, who would be a licensed sampler as well. A well driller might also employ a sampler, and then an interpreter interprets results, and that gets shunted to the private well program. Down and to the right, you'll see the health department and then public officials, the executive branch, and up and to the right, you'll see the Geographic Information System, the Department of Environmental Management, URI, and I add up in there as well EPA when they come in on Superfunds and other issues. And CDC works with the Director of Health. Straight up, you'll see the building official, well permitting, Department of Environmental Management again, where our drilling logs are, the contractors, registration and licensing board. And then what I am convinced is the most driving factor in our regulation is in the lower left-hand corner, and that's simply the money. It's simply the money. So in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see all the different things in blue are the owner, agent, buyer, bank, and attorney. Those are the elements of a real estate closing. There's a secondary lender, so that would be, so you go to a mortgage company or your buddy or the guy who lends you the money, and he's going to craft that loan in such a way that it meets uniform underwriting guidelines for Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or FHA, and they're going to assign that mortgage to the lender. And those underwriting requirements include the FHA single home appraisal process. And in there's a box to check. It's very simply, is this on public water or is it on an individual private water supply? The second they check individual private water supply, if your state does not have its own independent requirements, it's my reading that the water must meet the federal EPA guidelines on the MCLs. That's my current reading of that. And then I've seen this in action all the way back to HUD, because about a year and a half ago, I received a call from the HUD Inspector General's office asking about a property that they lent money on, which included the addition of a new well, and they wanted to see the entire paper chain. And I was very happy that we were able to produce the entire paper chain. But it's amazing how talking to real estate agents, lenders, and the Rhode Island Bar Association really gets people motivated about this. When they recognize that there's malpractice risk or that there's a lending risk associated with not following the regulations, and that there's a man on a tricycle who will catch up to them, they move pretty quickly. So the effort has been in moving, sort of our next step is moving away from educating the individual buyers buyers and sellers and homeowners to talking to their agents, their banks, and people up the chain. I was recently at the Water Quality Association conference in Orlando, Florida, and had the good fortune of having that conference co-located with the American Banking Association, and snuck out of my conference and walked to the desk of the guy who was with Freddie Mac and had a conversation about, we really need to test this. And he gave me a contact at the appraiser's desk and said, you need to talk to this person because they're going to be the ones who can help you really lever that downhill to all of the people who they send out mortgagees letters to. So, still working that connection. We only have so much time. Okay, so this was originally represented in about 1 million stickies on my wall when I first came into the office, and has since been compiled into that nice slide. So as a result of that, as a result of this testing regimen, we've had a couple of successes in terms of identifying hotspots and problems with land use. This is a map here. You'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, there's an agricultural field with 2 farm roads that run approximately north and south. And at the bottom of those 2 farm roads, in times of extreme flooding, the overland flow runs right across the street and into the wells across. And there was a home in that very bright pink area that was in the middle of a real estate transaction. Nitrate level came out approximately 30. It was 27, 28, which is 3 times the MCL, plus or minus, just shy of raw sewage, which would be 38 or 40. And we got a trigger from the building official. We went out and we conducted a radius search. And most of you know that nitrate is a cause of blue baby syndrome. Affects a pretty small population of infants under the age of 3 months who haven't yet developed the enzymes to properly absorb oxygen in their blood. When we put out a simple notice here, the story goes, because I picked up the phone on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, the first phone call to the office was an unregistered daycare facility, commonly known as a woman who keeps kids, and a bunch of screaming infants in the background. Now, I say that by way of saying that in every instance where I've identified a problem here, there's always a population at risk. There are always elderly people, there are always children, infants, there are always areas of poverty, and that's simply because where there are wells, there are people. So as you can see, we later mapped this entire neighborhood down into the south and west, found other areas, anything that's orange or red was either half or above the MCL for nitrate. And after some struggle, they proposed public water in this neighborhood. And the way well owners worked in 2015 in the light of Flint is they voted it down quite vociferously. So as a result of that private well testing, and this is an important part of what private wells are being used for in Rhode Island right now. Private wells are being used as a sensor network. We're the canaries in the coal mine. We went back and we looked at some historic data for the Silvera nursery and kindergarten, and you can see that blue line represents their nitrate levels, and 10 is the MCL, 5 is the health action level, and the green at one point hit 17 in a public water system. Now, when I pulled this data together, the first thing the private well owners wanted to say was, why didn't you knew back in January of 1988 that there were high nitrates in our well. Why are you telling us in 2014? So that was a moment. So we applied some of this nitrate data and developed a model for other areas that were at risk at the state. And this is a quick summary of the GIS work that we did. It's a composite model of population density, proximity to agricultural land, proximity to wells that had high nitrate hits in the past on the public side, and proximity to private wells that had high nitrate hits in the past. And it's basically a summated rank of 1 to 4 in each of those 4 quadrants, and then in the final map, 4 to 16. And you can see that there are hot spots that were identified by the bright purple and bright yellow. And the area that we were just at on the farm here is on the island in the southwest of the state. And you'll see there's a bright red area. And it's effectively a laboratory desert. So it's a laboratory desert. For those people to have their wells tested, they have to drive to the city of Providence, which is the urban area in the north, about an hour away, pick up a sample kit from the state lab, drive an hour south, draw a sample, get back in their car, drive an hour north with the sample on ice, submit it, have lunch, pay $95, turn around, drive an hour back, and then wait 2 weeks for the results. So it's not any wonder, to me at least, why it was taking so long for that area to recognize that this was a problem. The area to the right of them, to the east, Little Compton, has access to Massachusetts laboratories across the border, so they were getting more frequent testing. And it's amazing how you can't get there from here with the island the way it's shaped. So, okay. So as a result of that, we did a health equity study. We employed an intern to do some work for us. And we ranked on what I call my control panel, all the cities and towns in Rhode Island based upon a variety of health risk factors. That's the number of structures, the percentage on well water, the residents over 65, the residents under age 5, people who don't own their own home, people below the poverty line, people without a high school diploma, and minority. And we set our outreach priority. So that's that piece of paper here. So this sets our outreach priority. And we actually submitted this for a CDC grant, which we did not get, which was going to basically allow us to pre-position sample kits in the various towns. But the point here is it allowed us to figure out that there were towns that we hadn't been to with outreach efforts in some time that had significant risk. And more interestingly, the town that was most impacted by this recent event was smack dab in the middle, in that they weren't an area that had a lot of wells. They had a good chunk of public water in the town, and they weren't an area that was high on our, that was all public water. They were in the middle and had been largely ignored by our outreach efforts. And it wasn't until there was a problem identified by our testing that we took action. So that's a closer view of some of the things that are on the piece of paper. We used a cookie cutter approach using what I call our E911 structures database. We buffered the public water system layer by a 200-foot buffer outside of the pipes, used that as a cookie cutter, sliced that out, and then everything that wasn't on public water was on private wells. And that was a good go-by. As a result, we were able to target some outreach into areas that had not seen us in a while, and we had some pretty amazing turnout. So we had people, one of the towns we went to, half of the samples had coliform bacteria, one with E. coli. We went to one community where 26 people met us in the basement of a public library during a snowstorm because nobody had been from the state had been out there in a while. We had a full house town meeting in Tiverton. When I full house, there was over 140 people who showed up and wanted to know more about their well water. And on a beautiful July day in a beach community, 65 attendees came in. A third of the samples had coliform bacteria, one with E. coli. And it was just something counterintuitive. We never thought that you'd go to the beach to have a well workshop, but it seemed to work. We have a very creative intercept campaign. Someone spoke earlier about going and reaching out to where the well owners are instead of expecting them to come to us. So we figure out where the people are going to be. We went to the Rhode Island Home Show. We went to the flower show and co-located with she calls herself the flower lady. And anywhere there was water, we tried to get ourselves. We recently did a pretty thorough study of the farmers markets in Rhode Island. And the farmers markets we found where they in the past would be charging a fee to put up a booth at the farmers market, they wanted us there and we were able to get in for free because we were perceived as value added. We weren't there to sell them anything, we were there to educate them about their wells. And we say fish where the fish are. In the course of studying the farmers markets, we recognize that many farmers markets are not as successful as they promote themselves to be, that many farmers markets are for the tourists and not for the locals. And we had a student go through and they visited the farmers markets and they made basically a hit list of here are the good farmers markets, we should go there again, here are the bad ones, and here are the ones that really have our audience. So we have limited resources, you can't go everywhere all the time. Okay, so some of the achievements, we got a public water extension proposed into an area that had nitrate. The slide's been updated to show that it was soundly rejected. We managed to review all child care facilities on wells within the state. We reviewed all public water systems for nitrate levels. There was a substantial amount of community organizing in the towns of Tiverton, Charlestown, Johnston, and Middletown. And we did a quality improvement project regarding pre-positioning of test kits in case of emergency. The quality improvement project recently played out in real life last year when we had a drought that we found out from the emergency manager in the town of Tiverton, one of those towns that we did some community organizing, who heard a report of a neighborhood who hadn't showered in 3 weeks because he had a well that was dry. And when he started asking around, many people's wells ran dry in that area of the state last year, to the point where he didn't have fire protection for the lower half because his intakes in the fire retention ponds, in the impoundments for water, were above the water line. So there was a response of pre-positioning kits and getting some emergency resources to them. There have been some lawn ordinances passed in Charlestown, Rhode Island, where nitrates levels are rising up to the point where we're seeing them approach 8, 9 milligrams per liter in the public water systems. The lawn ordinances have been put in place to minimize the application of fertilizer and license the professionals who do that. And recent challenges, these are just a few, I'll go over them. Some site impact assessments for Superfunds. We have a community where we identified a significant amount of VOCs where we would not have seen VOCs in the past. We had a drug enforcement action with somebody, so marijuana is legally available in Rhode Island for medicinal purposes, but most people overestimate the number of plants that they're allowed to grow for municipal purposes. And they don't seem to understand that refining marijuana using butane is a violation of that. And so we found on a Superfund site, which is in retrospect a really good place to locate a meth or a drug lab, mainly because law enforcement doesn't want to go there. We found evidence of an occupancy where in the Superfund evaluation, a new compound, isobutanone, was found in large quantities. And we all learned that isobutanone was being used to refine marijuana to make what are called dabs. It's a tarry marijuana substance which is smoked. So it was as a result of testing the neighbor's well that we identified the isobutanone, and then that led to circling in on this. So not something we really wanted to get involved in. And then emergency preparedness, I mentioned, drought, flood, and hurricane. And that's what I have. Write this down, riwelltesting.org. That's riwelltesting.org. You also find it on that 2-pager that I gave you. That is where all of our documentation is, and it's where the program from Allison McCann at the University of Rhode Island puts all of our educational material. Thank you.
Quick question? Anyone got a quick question? Well, okay, go ahead.
So I'm really interested to learn more about how you kind of did the ranking for kind of that health equity spreadsheet, I'll call it. But I'm curious if that made you kind of think about the different types of outreach you would do in these targeted communities based on the different factors that seem to most prominently put that county or area in the ranking that it got at the end.
Right. So it helped us initially, and this was a year and a half ago, year and a half ago. So we've had essentially one full cycle of revisiting these with well workshops. So it was principally to set a priority list, and beyond that, we have not used it. Certainly there are people drool over that stuff and say, well, we should target it differently, but that's really outside my expertise, and I'd be happy to share that information with anybody who wanted to go further on that.
All right,
Thank you.
That's yours.
Yes, thank you.
Good job. Thank you.